we are talking about Japanese castles with two historian, authors, researchers, Ran Zwigenberg and Oleg Benesch. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for having me, having us.
It's great. It's great to have you both on the show. We had a great talk with you, Ran, a couple weeks ago about your wonderful book about Hiroshima and the narratives and how the branding of the city has changed over time. And a lot of that plays into the same kind of stories that both of you guys have introduced in your beautiful, wonderful book on Japanese castles and citadels. Here we go. Here's the cover. Citadels of Modernity in War and Peace, Japan's Castles. How did this project, how did this collaboration get started between you two?
Well, I think I'll maybe say this to I'll tackle it so Ron doesn't need to kind of blow his own horn, so to speak, because I think a lot of it originates in his other work on Hiroshima. I mean, Ron and I met at a conference in Tokyo in 2013, so yeah, almost 10 years ago now, and kind of over the kind of buffet, I guess. And we're just going to start talking about castles. Ron mentioned it, and I think, and Ron can correct me here, but it was essentially, you know, in the work he was doing on Hiroshima in the 1950s and this rebranding of the city in terms of turning into a peace city, he kept, you know, coming across the documentation referring to the castle reconstruction, and people, you know, essentially saying, well, why are you rebuilding this castle, this symbol of militarism? This is not on brand, and that it was a hugely controversial thing. And he talked about it then in the book, on his Hiroshima book, but then, you know, there was a much larger thing there. I don't know if Ron, if that's an accurate representation.
Yeah, more or less. Thank you. Oleg. Yeah, it goes back to my first book. I had a really tiny bit on the Hiroshima, which connects also, of course, to Bushido. This is where actually the conversation started, on this connection between this, right? Because what happened in Hiroshima, and we can talk more about Hiroshima Castle later on, if they built this castle, they rebuilt this castle after the war. So did a whole bunch of erasing of what this castle meant before the war. I mean, where he worked on the connection between modern Japanese states, not just, of course, sports and other things. And you can explain more of it. And as warrior values, which were not quite, right? Rehashed, reinvented. And the same with, I think, with castles, right?
You mentioned the Bushido, and I heard that, Oleg, in your videos about Japan castles, which I assume is connected to your book in a lot of ways. Those introductions that you've done. I hope to see more of those. You've only got 3, right, Oleg?
Yeah, there are a few more in the pipeline. It's on the to-do list. That was something that happened early lockdown when everything else got canceled, and then things start opening up again. And but I've got we've got a few more in the pipeline. But yeah, I think it's been a lot of fun doing those. I mean, just to maybe back to it, like mention a bit what Ron said there about kind of like Bushido, this kind of idea of the way of the samurai, the way of the warrior. I mean, that's a great image you've got up right there, because, you know, these are essentially a bunch of university staff and students cosplaying samurai around 1910. Is what all these photos are, and then taking photos of themselves in armor and things. But what happens after 1945 is, you know, this kind of what I guess is the dominant version of masculinity in Japan at that time is really kind of discredited, you know, by the defeat and then the US occupation. And what happens is you really have a search for like kind of a new type of masculinity, and like trying to recover some kind of martial values. And, you know, you can't really look at the imperial period for obvious reasons, but if you jump back far enough and look at the samurai period, so kind of pre-1860s, that's where you can maybe start to recover some kind of, model masculinity again. And that's where we see this, there's all these samurai films that are coming out in the 50s again, but that's also where you have this flurry of castle building, of trying to, recreate these pre-modern spaces that were, kind of these symbols of Japan. So that's kind of the dynamic we're looking at.
Yeah, and the common themes of your book and of your videos, of your work, it seems, are how a lot of the castles that we see now around Japan have more of a focus on the feudal, the samurai past, and kind of gloss over the modern militarism and our modern sightseeing places that a lot of the community and locals really appreciate, as well as the visitors coming from other areas. Is that one of the main themes?
Yeah, basically the role that nostalgia plays in erasing certain unwelcome aspects of the recent past. And about Okunoshima, the island next to Hiroshima, where you have all those tourist attraction, which basically consists of a lot of bunnies, right? There is bunnies there, but there's also this factory for that was there, and it's this this is really
gas. Yeah, the poison gas.
Poison gas. That's a very obvious contrast. But what's fascinating about Castle is that the exact same building had very war. Well, it's not quite exact same building. A lot of time they're destroyed and rebuilt. But Hiroshima. But actually, Hiroshima is you see here in the pre-war, before was this destruction. It's a bit of an exception because not so many destroyed during the war. Well, it was 7, I think, right? I think.
Yeah, of the original keeps. I mean, the Tenshu, that the big structure at the center that you showed in the photo earlier. I mean, there were about 20 original keeps from the pre-modern period that still survived in Japan. There's a photo of it there, and then about 7 of them were destroyed then around the wartime. So not that many.
That was a very good picture, actually. After we see the Imperial Army, and you saw a couple of more pictures before, Imperial trains in front of those castles, and it's very important to notice. And I think in the coming out of the Meiji Emperor from the Imperial Castle going to Hiroshima, Sino-Japanese War.
These pictures are amazing. And don't they look so European, like the chariots and the uniforms, and then next to the castle? And this is this juxtaposition of like mixed military themes with the samurai past, the modern military, the samurai feudal past. Those themes were also used in more modern sightseeing postcards and things that you guys talk about too, right? That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it takes a while for these kind of themes to come together in kind of the modern military, and for them to actually start using the samurai past. There's a bit of a break. And so, I mean, just I guess as a bit of background for people who aren't maybe as familiar with it, is, I mean, Japan, almost every major city in Japan, and even most minor cities in Japan, seem to have like a big castle at the center of them. If they're older places, it's now usually a park or something else. But these castles, when kind of the new imperial government comes in 1868, these castle spaces are now no longer useful for their older purposes. They essentially clear out the feudal lords and the samurai, and it's the same time where they're constructing a new imperial army, which they put into the castle spaces. And I mean, initially these are just a space for the army. They're in the center of the city, but it's just quite convenient. There's really a large rejection of the samurai actually in the 1870s, 1880s. They're not really a model for anything. I mean, we now have a commoner conscript army. It's a very different way, and it's the West is very much more a model. And I mean, those images, those woodblock prints, as you pointed out, they are using, you look at a lot of the features and everything, and people are looking, they're depicted in ways that are quite Western. And we really see this in like woodblock prints from around the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars that, you know, the Japanese soldiers are often portrayed in ways that look very similar to the Russian soldiers. And so they're really drawing on a lot of European models here. But then probably around the turn of the century, there becomes a little more appreciation of that samurai heritage, and they start to try to recover this. And then the military starts to actually use the fact that they are in these former samurai castles. They use that imagery to kind of try to link to supposedly ancient kind of martial values and like a samurai spirit and kind of draw on that. And that's then, you mentioned kind of later postcards in the 1920s, 1930s, which are really starting to use that as propaganda and really trying to link this supposed samurai spirit to the castles. I mean, this is a great image here of some military maneuvers in Osaka. You know, we see the castle there, the castle keep on the back left up above, and then we can see it off in the distance there. And we see all those soldiers in the front marching on these maneuvers, and we see all the biplanes up in the air above. I'm pretty sure those are probably some early version of Photoshop. I don't think there are that many biplanes probably flying there. But you know, some of them look a little bit too similar to
Yeah,
to
and
maybe
it's
be
really
real.
it's the three juxtaposition of this postcard, which I find really striking, right? The industrialism and the modern military and the traditional castle all together on one postcard is really striking, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean those are the really kind of key elements, is like, you know, kind of bringing the best of modernity together with like kind of this ancient Japanese spirit supposedly. And I mean, one thing that I think it's something we really point out in the book, and I think it's important to note, is that, you know, this is not like some, you know, weird Japanese thing or uniquely Japanese. I mean, the rest of the world is doing this. I mean, especially Europe. I mean, the United States is doing the same thing. If we think about like the 19th century, the Victorian chivalric revival, you know, when Japanese ambassadors go to Britain, you know, the most powerful modern empire in the world, they're visiting the queen in a castle. You know, there are all these ideas of chivalry that are like coming into the First World War. You know, they're drawing on medieval knighthood, and I mean, there's a very conscious exchange between these types of like kind of feudal masculinity, a very much idealized one, between Japan and other countries. So the things that are going on in Japan are very similar to elsewhere. But yeah, Ron?
Yeah, I just want to make that the way the Japanese see their own development to how they see Europe. They want to see themselves as same as European, so they want to also on European past. So, for example, the way you say the way the Japanese even look at Westernized. I mean, the way that they look at their own periods. So, for example, they, why would they have a Middle Ages, right? I mean, why it's still a common trope. People still, and then Kinsei to Tokugawa. There was this really amazing thing you tweeted like a week ago, Oleg, about Shigetaka, what's his name, right? Do you remember
Shigetake? Yeah.
It's true for many parts of Japanese culture, right? Like adopted the imported ideas, but made it very Japanese, made it their own. People are often shocked when they visit, and coffee and toast is such a great thing in Japan, but it doesn't seem Japanese, but they've been doing it so well, their own style, since the 1920s, right? And was that military uniform kind of importing but making it Japanese? Is that kind of a similar idea, making it their own?
It is, but I think they are what they see as their own tradition, right? They're very Japanese. Like, so all those images have very symbolic, like just symbolic verbal work on your side, like Western technology, Japanese spirit. This is a little, but something exists also in Chinese. Also use a similar phrase, right? And see those tropes, meaning like the antiquity, Japanese and modern technology, we still keep our spirit. The very idea of presenting their own history, taking something Western and making it Japanese-esque, right? I don't even know if it's a word, but making it Japanese and teenage Americans is I think something else is going on here, right? It's and and Oleg, you wrote all about it. The idea of their own past, who they are, is actually westernized.
And one thing,
Yeah, go ahead.
I would just sorry, one thing I just like I want to emphasize though, because it's quite important, is that this isn't kind of unidirectional, Japan learning from the West or Japan appropriating things and kind of adapting them. That this is actually, it's going in both directions. So, in the 1890s, when thinkers in Japan are like, they're looking at Victorian Britain and kind of the chivalric revival when they are kind of reinventing the way of the samurai. They're using that very explicitly as a model. And so that, there is this kind of influence coming from Britain. But by 1900, certainly by 1902, when we have an Anglo-Japanese alliance formed, the British are now looking at Japan as a model. And they are bringing in samurai ideals, or what they see as being that. And you get people like social theorists writing about how British society needs to be more like Japan. It needs to be better organized. They need to have like kind of these warrior ethics. And I mean, this is incredibly widespread. One of the really good examples of this is Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scout movement. I mean, if you read his book, Scouting for Boys, early 20th century, and he's talking about samurai, he's talking about Bushido, he's talking about like Japan as a model for like Britain and especially kind of British youth. And so, this is around the time of the Russo-Japanese War. And so it's just to emphasize that, it's not just kind of Japan appropriating things. It's essentially like, Europe and the United States, they're appropriating Japanese things in the same way. And it's quite cyclical. And then when we start bringing in somewhere like China, which is, being influenced by both Japan and the West, and it's also influencing them, then, we get this really complicated kind of entangled history of ideas, this movement. So
No, yeah, that's a really good point. Very important. When I talked with author Matt Alt, he talks a lot about the export of Japanese inventions and Japanese toys and many things, and how Japan's culture over the years has really influenced America and other countries. So yeah, definitely important point to point out there. We've talked a bit about Hiroshima Castle. I went around this morning to refresh myself before this talk. Some of the things I had never heard, even though I've lived in Japan since 96, was how I knew about the conflict. Are we gonna create the castle again? Because we now have a new narrative for Hiroshima, that Hiroshima is the city of peace, and the castle is connected to the military past. And how do we have a consistent narrative and have the castle? And then they thought about having a Statue of Liberty there. I had never heard of that. Absolutely incredible. I think you showed me a news clipping, right, Oleg?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, Ron, do you...
yeah, that's from yeah.
So it wasn't called the Statue of Liberty. It was image of peace. It wasn't adopted. They didn't do it, but they considered it, right?
Yeah. The goddess of peace. Something they did do, and they put the road, the Carp Road, Carp Castle Road, is now used to be MacArthur Road. So, but there was this wave of cherishing, and so what happened after the war? There's a couple of the first couple of years, really in the beginning, under the occupation, the reckoning with militarism. Now we have to remember that Hiroshima, like almost all Japan, like all castle town, military town. What happened in Hiroshima, like many other places, we can talk more about the economy later. Their economy very much dependent, or a lot of those, let's say here, the gate, the Torii Gate over there is the Gokoku Jinja, is the nation shrine of the Yasukuni Shrine,
which we now see right on the Hiroshima Castle grounds. It's been moved,
used to be somewhere else, where the baseball stadium came out. It
used to be now where we have the Children's Museum, right? That area, the old baseball stadium area.
Yeah, it extended all the way there. It's for those who don't know Hiroshima, well, doesn't mean anything, but it's next to.
It's near the Ibom Dome. You can see the
It's really opposite
area
the
here.
dome.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is an incredible photo.
Yeah, so he would stand. The castle itself will be behind Hirohito angle. Now, what happened in Hiroshima is they're very much dependent on military, economically. Something that we talk about when tens of thousands of soldiers probably perished in Hiroshima because the headquarters of Japan, and Hiroshima was very important for Japan's wars, and Hiroshima was the center of Hiroshima identity before the war because it imperial headquarters for the Sino-Japanese War. And there was, if today August 6th is calendar of Hiroshima, September 15th, which was the day when the went into Hiroshima, was the most important day in the calendar before the war. Of this, after the war, the bomb is actually seen as being hard for us to wrap our mind around this, but it seems as a baptism that washed military sins. But there is an emphasis on the military that we have sinned, right? So symbolically, and this is what the article talks about that you mentioned before, said the castle has to be pure. It's all very religious terms. It's very to purify. In order to purify it, you have to put a thank you, more or less, a thank you. They don't say American to a symbol of the rebirth of Hiroshima. But it's yeah.
And just actually on that image, just the one you just showed again of the, just for people who might not be familiar with that, what's going on in this in the photos there is the photo behind the statue that's the base of Hiroshima Castle. The castle keep was on top of that, and the castle keep was blown over by the bomb. It didn't burn; it just was blown over, and it was just a bunch of kind of scrap lumber around that was then used by homeless people in Hiroshima to like build temporary shelters and build what's known as the A-bomb slum after that.
Yeah.
And the idea was essentially then to build the Statue of Liberty on that former castle keep, the castle base, which is in that image. So this the statue, or the goddess of freedom, as it says there. So yeah,
and,
I mean,
and that castle base is the original back to the 1500s, isn't it? It's amazing. A lot of the castle structures, the foundations date back over 1,000 years, right? Amazing.
Yeah, I'm not sure how heavily rebuilt they were. I mean, one thing with a lot of the with a lot of Japanese castles is the stonework as well. Given kind of earthquakes and other things that happen in Japan, they do have to be redone quite a bit. And some of the most famous castles in Japan are actually really concrete reinforced now. The stonework, it looks original from the outside, but I mean, places like Osaka, I believe Himeji as well might have quite a bit of modern reinforcement in it.
Well, that was another thing I was surprised about from your book, was that actually even Hiroshima, the inside is concrete and steel. Whereas from the outside looking at it, you think it's the original wood style. And Osaka is the same. Himeji is the same. So many of the renovated castles are actually made of concrete. Is that right?
Himeji, I get
one of the.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Himeji is still kind of an original one. It's still made of wood, which is why it's so famous. I mean, Himeji was also a military base. It was also bombed in the war. Supposedly, a bomb actually hit the castle and it didn't go off, a dud. But the castle actually, I mean, these are from some military expos in Himeji in the 1930s. These photos. That's a great one. You can see the connection between military and the castle there in the background is from Himeji, like a national defense expo. And so Himeji was one of the few to survive. The thing with these castles, you have to redo the stone every now and then because it does shift. But like the wooden keeps up top, most of these are late 16th, early 17th century. Himeji, I think, is early 17th century. And, the wood only lasts so long. And so there's a huge reconstruction in the 1960s, I think, is the first one. I mean, there's one in the 30s, another one in the 60s, where they go and they take out all the rotten timbers. They really disassemble a lot of it, replace it. They did the same thing in Himeji about 10 years ago. I think it reopened about 4 or 5 years ago. People might remember it. It's gleaming white again, right? It had gotten a bit darker. But that's the thing. You have to really take these things almost apart and replace a lot of it. And that's where, you know, you do kind of get issues and questions about authenticity. Like if you're replacing all of the timbers, is it still the original? You know, what percentage of timbers can you replace and still have it be original? And so, but in the 1950s, everything was being made of concrete. I mean, also because, you know, it looks great from the outside, more or less authentic in many cases, but it's really durable, right? I mean, you've just gone through this experience of having everything destroyed in the war. So now you want to build from concrete rather than wood if you can. But I mean, Ron, I think probably has some more to add on that.
The fire worries that they had a lot
Yeah.
with the bombings and during the war, right?
Mm.
You can
Yes.
imagine.
So our main parts, right, before the war, in our line of work, people were in continuities, but in the break between what happened before. So before the war, we started talking before in the 1870s, 1880s. It's lasted through the end because, again, a lot of rotten wood, fires. I mean, the biggest in keep in Japan, the Edo keep 1657, and what wasn't
Which
rebuilt.
one is that? Is that in Kanagawa?
Edo.
One of the oldest one?
Oh, Edo
Edo.
Castle in Tokyo now, was now
In
Tokyo.
Tokyo. Yeah.
And it's actually interesting. I didn't catch it because, or anybody. What's the biggest? No one. It's big. Imperial Palace is a castle.
Yeah.
That's
So
Toyama. I think you had a picture of the U.S. occupation in the Imperial Palace. I
Yeah.
hadn't realized that they took over the Imperial headquarters as well. That makes sense. They
Yeah,
took
I think,
over all the military installations around Japan, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, Ron, I think your sound cut out there for a second earlier. I think it was just you're mentioning that, you know, the biggest castle is what is now the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, which was the shogun's castle up until the late 1860s. And, you know, that then becomes the modern emperor's palace. It becomes, again, it's a huge military base. The bits around it, the center is, you know, the Imperial Palace, Imperial Castle as it was known until the late 1940s.
Yeah.
After the end of the war, they wanted to get rid of the castle connotation, the military connotation, and they renamed it the palace. But yeah, you know, the U.S. military took it over like they did all the other military sites, and that was a lot of castles in Japan as well. They're suddenly occupied by the U.S. Army, or then, you know, which to a lot of people in Japan, it's not a huge change in some ways, because all these castles were, you know, military property and off limits before 1945. And after 1945, they still are. It's just you now have, you know, a foreign occupying army rather than the Imperial Japanese Army.
Oleg,
Yeah.
you had a
And-
lot of interesting insights about Osaka, and it seems like Osaka has a very interesting shifts in narrative over the years in how, especially that original castle was rebuilt because the people wanted it, but the military said to raise money, we also want a building. Tell us that story, and then how it's used now is so different, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things that we noticed actually when we were researching this, I mean, that's a picture of the Osaka Castle Keep in the 1930s, because most of these castles like Hiroshima are rebuilt in the 1950s, but Osaka Castle is actually rebuilt and finished in 1932, and it's kind of the first major reconstruction out of concrete, and it's effectively, you know, Osaka Castle is the biggest military base in Japan. It's the largest arms factory in Asia, is in the castle grounds. I mean, you can see the scale of it in this photo here. I mean, it's huge. It's now a park, but essentially, you know, this is all off limits to the normal people of Osaka because it's a giant military facility. And they are actually, we're talking the 1910s. They want access to what they are starting to see as their heritage. And there's a big movement to get the military out of Osaka Castle. And the army doesn't want to leave, and so there's a lot of kind of negotiations. But around early 1920s, it's a period after the First World War where there's a lot more movement towards like internationalization and kind of democracy and things like that. And so the army comes up with a deal with kind of the civilian, various civil society groups, that they will give them access to the center and they will let them reconstruct the keep out of concrete, in exchange for the civil society groups and the civilians paying for a new building for the 4th Division headquarters. And so that's essentially the deal that gets struck. And they build both of these things at the same time. And actually, the 4th Division headquarters building takes up about 2/3 of the budget. The castle keep is quite a bit cheaper. And so both of these are essentially opened in 1932. It's still a big military base, but the people of the public now have access to the center of it, and they can tour the castle and the keep. And that kind of continues until the early 1940s when it's all locked down again. But it's interesting when we if people go to Osaka Castle now, the castle keep is still there from 1932, and that is still there. The 4th Division headquarters building, which is now Miraiza and is like kind of a wedding and restaurant venue. And it's quite exceptional, though, I have to say, in Japan, which is, I think is very interesting as a historian, is when you go into Miraiza and you walk past Tully's and the ninja shop, back in the corner is a little like history corner that actually talks about the military history of the site. And that's incredibly rare. Like almost nowhere in Japan in the castles do they talk about, that military history that, as Ron said, has been erased just about everywhere. But in Osaka, they actually address it also because, they have these giant military buildings left.
Yeah, I'd love to go. I've been to Osaka Castle. I've never been inside this building. And you said, like, if you go inside, the old original style, they've redone so you can appreciate like the 1930s style. You can sit in an upstairs bar, which is painted gold, which is probably more reminiscent of the feudal past, but it's kind of a combination of things. Looks very retro. It's real interesting, like combination, but it's like you said, it's so nice that they do have that clarity of the military past represented as well, right?
Places like Iwahashi that still have it, but I think in the Himeji video of Himeji. Himeji Castle is a huge empty space. But you don't know it's all full of barrels, or now it's all look like a park. So I don't know if we have the image of the roof of Osaka Castle. If you mention, you all see it's all military factories, all greenery, right? And it's a rather place to be a part of them.
The Osaka Castle roof, was it?
Yeah, I think your sound cut out again briefly there. The roof. I think you showed the image
from the air
earlier.
This one?
No, it was from the roof, just looking over the park, and
Oh,
there's
with
the golden
golden carp. Yeah.
So this is the view we see now from the top of Osaka Castle. I took this in 2018, and you can see it's almost all park, and there's one little building you can kind of see in the trees, like right in the middle of the image. You can kind of make out, which was kind of a chemical. Also weapons laboratory, chemical experiments laboratory by the Imperial Army. But then I don't know if you have the other image of what it looks like in the 1930s of the same view. It was kind of if we shared that, it's view north from Osaka Castle, 1930s.
This is the PR one, different.
Okay. Yeah,
your picture. I don't know if I have the.
Oh, maybe not. But essentially, everything in that image that's trees in the 1930s would have been military facilities.
Right.
So there would all have been brick buildings, barracks, like there's a clothing factory in there, and in that photo as well, just about everything in there that's trees would have been built up kind of barracks and other military facilities until 1945, and often beyond.
Wow. And just to mention about this golden carp, because I noticed at Hiroshima Castle as well today, they have a special exhibit in the museum where they show two of the very large, very colorful original carp that they found from Hiroshima Castle. And it's now on display inside the museum. And they're very colorful. Like this one's very gold. Usually when you see traditional castles or roof, you don't see any color like gold or anything. So this is quite unique and special, it seems. You have a woodblock print from one of they're looking at the carp, and like very surprised by it. So is there something special about the style of the carp in Osaka Castle or Hiroshima Castle that you guys know of?
Ran, do you want to take the carp, or shall I?
The carp. So well, carp is a baseball, right? Pretty big. In
Is this a carp from a castle as well? The shachi, is it?
The shachi. So yeah, whether
we lost Ran. You want to go ahead?
We'll get it back shortly, but yeah. So this is the shachi hoko. It's translated either as like often golden killer whale or golden dolphin. One of the kind of meanings behind these supposedly is that we see them on the top of almost every castle roof, whether they're originally there or not. But in a lot of the reconstruction, sometimes they're quite small, sometimes they're very large, as in Nagoya. This is one of the ones from Nagoya in this woodblock print. And one of the things, they're supposedly supposed to ward off fire, like lightning strikes, supposedly. And not in kind of a practical sense, but kind of has almost like a protective spirit. And so in the early 1870s, these castles were almost all seen as like these kind of embarrassing reminders of kind of the feudal past. And the vast majority of them were torn down, of castle buildings. And in Nagoya, which is the largest kind of surviving keep in Japan at that time, they were going to tear this down. And one of the things they did is they took these giant carp, or these shachi off the roof, and they were gold. They're incredibly valuable, and they gifted them to the emperor, and they shipped them to Tokyo. And we see here this one being exhibited at Yushima Seido. I mean, the kind of Confucian shrine there in the Confucian temple just north of the palace. And one of them was exhibited there, and the other one was actually sent to Europe. And it goes to the World Exhibition, the World Fair in Vienna in 1873, before it comes back. And so they take these things off, and they're going to tear down the Nagoya Castle Keep. And then the story goes that a passing German diplomat like hears this and says, "Oh, you can't tear this thing down. This is, this amazing structure," and supposedly convinces the Japanese military to spare it. Whether it's actually him who did that, or it was some Japanese officers who did it on their own initiative, there's arguments. But then it's spared. And in the late 1870s, these shachi are replaced onto the roof, and Nagoya Castle is protected. It becomes an imperial detached palace, and it remains as like a really important site until 1945, when it's destroyed in U.S. bombing of Nagoya, and there's some pretty dramatic photos of the castle keep burning. I think May 1945. But
they're amazing. Were they actually this big, like bigger than people?
Yeah, they're very large. I think this is probably pretty close to scale. Would you say, Ron? Oh, we don't have sound for you.
No sound for Ren. Oh, we can't hear. Sorry. Maybe you could, in the chat, you could type your response and we could read it for you. Oh no.
Or dance it.
Or sign language. I'm not very good. Sorry. The one I saw in the Carp Museum today, Ran says he'll try to reload again. Okay. The one I saw in the museum for the castle today, they were much smaller. They weren't that big. They were maybe half person size, and they weren't golden. They were like ceramic, but painted black and bright colors, orange. So
Yeah.
quite unique.
Yeah, which I think is more common, perhaps. I mean, Nagoya was really famous for these giant golden shachi. I mean, it was really famous for those and still is. And yeah, so like Hiroshima or Himeji have much smaller ones. And they will be just kind of often this kind of gray or like a ceramic color. It's Nagoya, I think, is the outlier rather than the others.
They on the poster they were talking about the excavation site in Hiroshima, so it was obviously uncovered from somewhere. I don't know the full story. Ran, do you have audio?
Yeah.
Yay!
Can you yeah, good.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
The place where they found them, it's the same site. It's they probably dropped. Again, the burned. It was blown away. So whatever it was on the castle fell to the boat. Right. So there's stories, about from the moat, and like they went into the mud, and it's a very typical picture story of heroic recovery and rediscovery.
Yeah, it's interesting. You guys talk about how some of the wood from the castle was used in the slums to rebuild some of the homeless housing right after the bombing. That would have been incredible to see, right? In the shacks, if there were parts of the castle. But making use of any available wood, right? Yeah, maybe couldn't recognize. One of the other things where the moats were filled in, right? So was it 3 moats originally around Hiroshima Castle? And now there's only one. But if you look at one of the photos, I think you shared in the video, Oleg, about the tram lines, and that the tram lines is actually over one of the moat areas. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Ron knows Hiroshima, I think, a lot better, but you still see it in the names. I mean, a lot of Japanese cities, anything with like something hori or bori, those station names, that will always be something with the moat.
This is Hachobori, that's correct. So one of the biggest tram stations in Hiroshima, Bori. So it's the eighth hori, 8 moats. So Japanese street, a lot of Japanese, the way the Japanese sit on the old architecture of the castles. So yeah, they refill the moat. And then the Americans, when they take over castles, they fill the moat in Kumamoto. And then after, when they rebuild Kasara, they bulldoze the whole thing, redesign it to make it built again. And Shimabara is now basically in the middle of a part of the middle of
Wow. So this is the aerial view of where Hiroshima Castle is now, but there would have originally been a bigger area around where the red is. Is that right? For the whole castle grounds, it sounds like.
That's
this all the way to the river. Yeah, amazing.
So the castle during the Edo period, because there's a bit of a shrinking restoration. So it would be go all the way to the opposite Eiban Dome. There would be a military police, a Kempeitai office, and then on the other side there will be the Goku Jinja, the shrine. So went all the way to Nakajima, all the way to to Ground Zero, basically.
Wow.
They didn't important. I mean,
go ahead.
They didn't aim at the castle. They aimed at the civilian. When we started writing the book, we thought, well, a lot of the castles burned down during the war, with most of the castles destroyed before 1870s. But then even the castles of the war did destroyed because they were aimed. The Americans aimed at destroying the military, aimed at destroying civilian areas. They didn't aim, and a lot of time, like place like Himeji, I mean, like there's a reason why. I mean, a lot of it was luck, but also because they aim at a military basis. So
Yeah.
Mm.
In
Yeah.
terms of rebranding a city, we talked about the Hiroshima rebranding with the Statue of Liberty, with rebranding as the City of Peace, and talking about feudal history and not really the modern military history. You also gave examples of rebranding in terms of with elephants or zoos. Is this Odawara? They had a Ferris wheel. They had animals. This is also part of the rebranding. Is this post-war? Maybe 1940, you said?
Late 1940s. Yeah.
Mm.
Notes.
yeah,
Go ahead, Ron.
Also post-war.
Yeah.
As well. Okay.
Post-war. So yeah, elephants. Ian Miller has this really great elephants meme. So this is a Umeko. Poor elephant was in a tiny zoo, and really, they still have monkeys there. If you go there, it's still a very, I don't know, for our contemporary, pretty weird place. It still have there, but they used to be also a zoo in Himeji, and there to have animals in it because, and we see also the ferries as part of rebranding, and also in Hiroshima they build amusement parks around the purpose in order to, let's erase the mill. They do it because it's a big empty space where you can use for a big exhibition. So that's what happened also before. Have a lot of children entertainment also before the war, but be side by side with tanks, right?
And another rebranding style was to change military facilities into sports facilities that you talk about, right?
Sports and art, and a lot of you have the space, but you have the added bonus of moving from war. So yeah, the Carp stadium that was there that was built in I think also it's on the former side of the Kempei Tai, right? Bus station on Hiroshima again. It's a lot of real estate. Both before real estate is a big thing. Who gets all this land, right? So then the symbolic part.
And in terms of sustainability, it's kind of good that they're reusing the buildings in some way. They're not completely destroying a decent building to reuse, if you're thinking just for the environmental point of view. But like you mentioned in Osaka, by reusing that military building, they have become a bit more transparent in how they tell about the military past. So if you completely destroy the building, there would be no reason to talk about that military past, right? So there is that as well. Go ahead.
I mean, Osaka is interesting because they actually talk about the history in that building, which, I mean, we mentioned Himeji. I mean, Himeji, I think it's the Hyogo Prefectural Art Museum, which is just to the east of the center of the castle, which is these big brick kind of storehouses, which were military storehouses before, and now it's the art museum. So they've reused the buildings there. Kanazawa is similar. There's an art museum in the former military storehouses, but these aren't as explicit about the history as Osaka Castle is. And I mean, they have reused the building, so from sustainability perspective, that's a good thing. But they aren't quite as upfront about what was there before.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead, Ran.
Sorry. Another good example is I think that was with Kanazawa, because there's something else happening there in Kanazawa and also in Shuri, which is a lot of the used lately. The first move was when reuse of the building was to make it a university. Real estate. There's a lot of fights over what's going to become. They make it into a university, and again, from swords into no plowshare but pens, right? It's very symbolic. to students. This is
Guns
very,
to
very
book.
simple move.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's
guns to book.
a lot of schools go into castle grounds. Again, you have space.
Yeah.
In Kanazawa is important is that they kind of kick the university out and do the same thing in Shuri, making the whole space into like return to the past, a beautiful pasting of all the modern, well, not complete, just they kept one building with no explanation. So now it looks much nicer. Actually, they sell it through Echo, right? It's in wood. It's harmonious because we love the environment. It's a whole exercise in layering history. Not quite layering, but
yeah, making it more complex narrative than a simple one. Which is sometimes big part of rebranding things, right? Can I ask, what is the controversy with the elevators? Why is putting an elevator in Nagoya Castle so controversial? It happened from the 1950s, was it?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are all, and starting with Osaka Castle, that's Nagoya Castle, the original wooden one from the 1870s. They've taken the shachi off the top. But starting with Osaka Castle, in 1932, they rebuilt it out of concrete, and the inside of these castles, they're modern concrete buildings. So of course you have an elevator in there. You have modern amenities. You have air conditioning. I mean, you showed the Mitsubishi ad for elevators, and they're concrete, and it's fine. That's Mitsubishi elevator advertisement using the castle. It's no problem with concrete. The issue, though, that we have, and I mean, just like a much larger issue, which is now going on in Nagoya, is concrete gets old and starts to crumble. As anyone familiar with American infrastructure can tell you, things that were built in the 1930s and 40s really start to get old and crumble. And so Osaka Castle already in the 90s was in really bad shape, and they were thinking like seismically, this is quite a dangerous structure. But they decided in Osaka that the concrete keep has lasted longer than any of the wooden keeps that preceded it, and they really like it. Actually, I mean, it's historically significant, and so they refurbished the concrete and modernized it, and it's now good for another however many decades. All the ones that were built in the 50s, like Hiroshima or Nagoya, those are now coming up to the end of their kind of life. And this is the big deal, is what we do with these aging concrete structures now that are supposedly unsafe, in case of an earthquake especially. And the idea is, in dozens of Japanese cities, is to like tear down these concrete keeps and rebuild the things authentically out of wood, make them eco, as Ron points out. The problem is, if you're going to rebuild this authentically, and for somewhere like Nagoya, which we have all of these amazing diagrams, we know exactly what that thing looked like when it was made out of wood, because it only burned in 1945, and they did great analysis and diagrams and everything. We could rebuild it exactly how it was, and that's what a lot of people want to do. But the problem is, then it's not accessible. Like you how do you put an elevator into that? How do you make it accessible? Kanazawa have managed it. They, in a lot of ways, it's not completely accessible, but there are a couple elevators and chairlifts. The issue with Nagoya is there's really this sharp divide between certain groups who want to just rebuild it completely authentically and very not accessible. I mean, it is a military fortification, it wouldn't have been that accessible. And then, a lot of other groups who are saying, this is a public building. It should be for everyone. It should be accessible. And if that means, putting an elevator in and making some changes, then that's what we need to do. And I was just actually looking on the website the other day of the castle, and they now have a big, it reached a kind of a crescendo, and there's now a big kind of drive. They've got a pitch that people should submit ideas, especially like companies, design firms should submit ideas for how you can make this barrier free. But they're quite clear in like the video they show that you can't just have an elevator going the length of it because of all the timbers and this and that. So please submit your ideas. There's a call there. I think the deadline is sometime in August. But it's a huge debate that's going to be relevant to all of these castles around Japan.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Making it more accessible, barrier free, which it should be the way forward for any new structure, right? And Nagoya Castle is huge. It's a really big one. So you could imagine there would have to be a lot of consideration of how to redesign it. And
Well,
if it was entirely wooden, that would be impressive. But yeah.
That'd be amazing. And actually, that image you just showed, if like at the bottom right, just behind the trees, there's a white box that people can maybe see, and that's an external elevator that was added, so people can actually get to that level of the keep, because it didn't have an elevator to actually get into the keep before that, and so that's a much later addition, just a couple decades ago, and that was very controversial because a lot of people, again, talking about authenticity, saying, "Oh, you can't put this big boxy elevator on the side of the castle," which is the same thing we have in Osaka, actually. And I mean, I have to say some of the positions are quite extreme. People saying, "Oh, well, if it's not completely authentic, then it's not worth doing."
That's a bit
kind of things,
ridiculous.
which-
I like how they've hidden the elevator with the tree. See, that's a nice compromise.
Yeah, I want to see well, Hiroshima's going to go through the same thing. They just submitted the plans. The reason why it's so controversial because it's all paid for by tax money. Not exactly all, but this is what makes also castles a great, for us as historians, a great thing. Because a great to learn from, because it generates a lot of controversy, a lot of opinion, a lot of people are very passionate about it. There's a lot of written about it. It's a great topic. One thing that I would like to mention also, that side by side, and how much people are really, really, really passionate about being authentic, and there's all this like fantasy. It's all wedded into like very fantasy idea of Edo, the unwieldy kind of connection between fantasy and hyper authenticity that you see now in Japanese castles.
Well, you historians must see that all the time, right? What is authenticity? It depends on who wrote that part of history in terms of authenticity. It's through lots of different lenses over time, right?
Where do you go back from?
Right? Yeah. So, yeah. Such an interesting talk. Now, one of the other things you just mentioned, Ran, about the public paying for the castles. And that was a really interesting theme for me, which I didn't realize. And so then it becomes controversial to have a private shrine, which is actually quite connected to nationalist kind of ideas about war criminals and Yasukuni, but it's on the same land as the public castle grounds. I love how the public castle grounds are like a park. People can use it for picnics and stuff. But that is definitely an interesting contrast. How do you balance that public-private conversation? And it seems like that conversation, that discussion is happening around Japan right now because some of the rules have changed for building codes because of the Olympics. Some public lands are becoming private because of rules that changed to make the 2020 Olympics. Any comments on that? The public-private contrast?
I might just with regard to those shrines. So as Run mentioned before, and we talked about a bit, is they've kind of erased the military history in just about all of these sites, and they're now parks, and they're focused on the pre-modern history. The modern military is gone, but one of the artifacts that is still there, that is often a witness to a former military site, are these Gokoku Jinja, these nation protecting shrines, which in the late 1930s were established as branch shrines to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, and roughly every prefecture had kind of one of these. And in so many cities, I mean, Hiroshima is a great example because it's right in the middle of the castle. If you see one of these shrines, that is probably former military land. Himeji Castle also has one just next to the castle. There's one in Kanazawa. There's one in Fukuoka. I mean, there are so many of these. Sendai is a good example. Nagoya, it's very,
the list.
yeah.
Is
I mean,
endless, right?
so if you see one of these, and because you mentioned the kind of public private, this is one of the problems they have immediately. Well, after the war, during the U.S. occupation, is that with the kind of separation of church and state under the occupation, what do you do with these kind of national sites, these national religious sites? And a lot of them were then kind of privatized. They were renamed in different things, and they were given just that land that they were on, and that land would be privatized. And there were various kind of ways around it. They were often renamed to something else, not Gokoku Jinja, because of the ties to the imperial. And then after the American occupation ends, then a lot of them get renamed back to Gokoku Jinja. But if you see one of these, you know, it's worth kind of thinking a bit more about like what the history of that site is.
It's really interesting because in Hiroshima, next to the castle, it is a real hub of activity for the first visit to the shrine on New Year's Day, for wonderful festivals that they hold there at all different times of year. So I never really thought of it having any connection to the military. Even now, it doesn't seem to have that strong narrative right now, but sometimes you can't see it.
Holding weddings, and there's a lot of all those like very civilian, beautiful. You know, there's the concrete keep right there, right? Everything, and there's sakura. There's great work by scholars about this. Again, it's a modern thing, by the way. Like planting sakura trees around buildings, connected to naturalize and conceal. Again, conceal. It serves to conceal. It's a kind of a conspiracy. It serves to conceal the very unpleasant history of this place. The land, actually, it's very complicated, and this and other temples show the very complicated history. Because eventually, the reason we have a park, the reason we have castle, supposed to be. And then after the war, you have all this land, and some will become private, some will become public. It's a really unsolved problem that a lot of Japanese cities still are trying to deal with.
Yeah, we see that inside Peace Park as well. We have some area right inside Peace Park, which is private for a restaurant. That's always really interesting. One of the things that I love about Hiroshima Castle, which we didn't mention yet, is there are 3 beautiful survivor trees, A-bomb survivor trees around the castle grounds. And that is a wonderful contrast in the narrative, but it's also a very important part of the Hiroshima brand. But I think it's something that the Hiroshima people do really appreciate, and it gives people hope. And whenever I do tours around the castle, visitors from around the world are very interested in the survivor trees. I'm not sure how the other areas do have as much complicated history as Hiroshima, but it seems like the people who are trying to create the narrative and create the modern sightseeing are mindful of the conflicts anyway. And there is information, and it is changing over time. Even in the time I've been here, new information has been coming out about the military past within the last 20 years. So it is fluid. It's not something that's set in stone. And that kind of gives me hope that people are reassessing. I hope that you guys see that as well in all your wonderful research of castles and everything. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us time.
Yeah.
And keep up the good work. Is there going to be a Japanese castles book number 2?
Oh. We'll see.
We moved to other things, but I'm going to think about daimyo now and statues a little bit, which is related. It's as a part of other things. You also do something related, right? The international bit.
Yeah. I'm focused now a lot more on kind of looking at these kind of global connections and how, kind of the medieval past, including castles and samurai, how that's remembered in Japan and how that ties in with kind of a whole global kind of remembrance of the medieval, especially kind of in Europe, the Americas, China as well. So yeah, still on similar themes.
Wonderful. Well, it's a great foundation work about the castles to draw on and always mention in the other work that you're doing as well. Thank you both so much. Have a great day.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
You too.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.